Welcome to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher, where we take you behind the scenes with peak performers to learn what makes them tick and discover how you can apply their lessons to your life. I'm your host, Molly Fletcher. How would our work and our lives change if we weren't so addicted to our devices? In his book, Deep Work, Cal Newport focused on the value of concentrated work in a world that is increasingly defined by electronic busyness. In his latest book, Digital Minimalism, Cal takes it a step further to explore our complicated relationship with personal technology. The key to living in a high-tech world, Cal says, is embracing a minimalist approach. What does he mean? In today's conversation, Cal walks us through a digital detox, an intentional decluttering process that thousands of people have already used to simplify their lives. Do you feel naked when you leave the house without your phone? Do you click on an email notification as soon as it comes across your screen? Do you find yourself constantly scrolling through Instagram or Twitter as a diversion? Then this episode is for you. Listen in to learn how to make technology work for you, not the other way around. Let's dig in right now. Here's my conversation with Cal Newport. Well, Cal Newport, what a treat to have you on. You're a busy man, so thanks for taking a minute.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So, Cal, let's dig right in here. Tell me this. What sparked your curiosity, really, about the intersection of technology and culture and really specifically our evolving relationships with technology?
Well, I think the fact that I'm a computer science professor played a big role in that.
Sure.
So my world, my training, I'm surrounded by technology. I work on the mathematics behind advancing our technology. And so this is a world in which I'm deeply immersed. And so I think for me, it was somewhat natural when I poked my head up out of that academic realm and wanted to look a little bit broader, that this is what I saw, all of these points of intersection where this tech, as it comes into our life, creates really complicated relationships. And when you get it right, it can be fantastic. And when you get it wrong, it can be terrible. And it's something that I don't think we think enough about. We're more ad hoc in our relationship with new technology than we likely realize. And so, to me, to be a technologist who also writes about the impact of these technologies, once I had that insight, it made perfect sense to me.
I couldn't agree with you more. Obviously, your perspective is so unique. I've heard you talk about, right, you're a better guy to talk about this than the guy that rolls out of the woods after years of camping, right, with not really the perspective that you have, which is such a powerful perspective.
Right. If you have someone, let's say, that is a dedicated off-the-grid survivalist Luddite or something like this. I mean, they might have some interesting stories to tell about what life is like in the cabin, but it's not going to be that relevant. So, yeah, I think we do need more voices from the world of technology working on these issues. And we need a lot of voices, but that's one particular set of voices I think is important.
So I want to talk a little bit about Deep Work, a book I so much enjoyed. And as I said before we went live, I need myself. So thank you for that. And we'll dig in, of course, to Digital Minimalism, which is your latest book, in a minute. But for our listeners, tell them, what do you mean by deep work? Can you sort of define that a bit?
It's a new term for a very old concept. That's what writers do, right? New vocabulary. But basically, it's my term for when you are focused without distraction on a cognitively demanding task. So basically, you have something that requires you to think hard, and you think hard on just that thing for a while without any distractions or attention switches. So it's something we're used to, but I think it's something that we really undervalue right now.
So if you think about the average person, right, what would be some examples of shallow work versus deep work? Maybe you can bring that to life a little bit for folks.
So I define shallow work essentially to be anything that's not deep work. So it's the catch-all. So the easy examples, for example, let's say you're sitting down and you're trying to write a chapter of a book or a strategy memo for your company, or come up with a new ad slogan if you're on Madison Avenue, or you're trying to write a particularly efficient piece of computer code, and you're just locked in thinking about those challenges. That's deep work. And then there's obvious examples of shallow work. Let's say you're skimming your inbox quick response here, forward this, respond this, ping that person there. That would be an example of shallow work. I think where it gets more subtle, and this is where it gets really important, is if you take one of those activities from the first bucket, so you're writing the code, you're writing the strategy memo, but every 10 or 15 minutes, you do that quick check of the inbox or of the phone, you think that you're still doing deep work, but you're not. That then becomes shallow work. And this is really the key element of deep work that I think is really important, is that for it to count, there can be zero context switches. You actually have to remain locked in. So I think even when people think they're putting aside good swaths of time for focused work, if what they're really doing is mainly working on the focused topic, but doing these quick checks back and forth, their effectiveness is staggeringly less. And that doesn't actually count as the type of deep work that I think can be so valuable.
And so is there do you have a guideline on sort of what is that? Is that an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours? Is there a window of time that you would say you get to that place where it's deep?
Well, a good rule of thumb is that a context switch can reduce your cognitive capacity for up to 20 minutes. So in order for a period of uninterrupted deep work time to really be worth the effort, I think it has to be at least an hour, because you're talking about maybe 15 or 20 minutes before you're even fully up to speed. And at that point, you want to actually get some results from having your brain humming around. So 60 to 90 minutes, I think, is a good default chunk size to work with.
So do you think people are confusing sort of this shallow work for productivity, at the expense of more meaningful work?
I think this is absolutely happening. I think knowledge work in particular is a mess, at least when it comes to how we think about producing value with our brains, which is the main activity of knowledge work, taking human brains, putting information into them, getting more valuable output out of them on the other ends. I think it's a mess. I think people are all over the place. And there's a good reason for this. It's because we have a culture within the knowledge work sector that says productivity is personal. Right? This is not, unlike, let's say, in the industrial sector, where you better believe a lot of thought goes into, well, how exactly are we building the cars? In the knowledge sector, the reigning idea, and this goes back very clearly to an incredibly important business thinker named Peter Drucker, who coined the term knowledge work in the 1950s. He came up with this notion: knowledge work is complicated. It's too hard to break it down like we would with manufacturing processes. Leave it up to the individual knowledge worker to figure out how to do their work. The goal of management is just to give them the objectives and the right incentives. There's an incredibly influential idea. He wrote a book called The Effective Executive, one of the very first business productivity books. He wrote that for a reason, because he thought this is how it should work. Knowledge workers have specialized skills. They know best how to apply them. Leave them alone. Just make sure they have the right objectives and the right incentives. Now, my argument is that as we get into a more high-tech age and knowledge work has become more complicated and fractured, and technology connects us in ways that Drucker could never have imagined, leaving productivity to be personal is leading to a confused mess of people all over the place, switching back and forth, sending 200 emails a day, jumping back and forth in the meetings, throwing Google invites all around, because there is no central thinking of, hold on a second, is this the best way to take human brains, our main asset, and get value out of it? And so I think that's where we are now, and that's why we see so little of the real value-producing activity. And that's why I'm writing about the topic, is at least trying to bring some vocabulary back that, hey, guys, wait a second. Let's step back and look at this, like Henry Ford stepping back and saying, wait, how are we building cars? And make sure that there's not a much better way that we're missing.
This stat really stood out to me, that the average person spends more than 60% of the work week engaged in electronic communication and internet searching, with 30% of that dedicated to email alone, which is interesting. So what tips do you have, because I think we all deal with this, to sort of regain control of email?
Right. Well, and I can tell you even more recent data makes that picture even worse. More recently, I have been working with a software company called Rescue Time that has a product that you can put on your computer that just monitors for your own information how much you're using different applications. They can collect this data and anonymize it on the back end and actually do analysis, fine grain, minute to minute, how over 50,000 knowledge workers are using their time. So they can go in and say, not only how many minutes is the average user of our software spending email, but where are those minutes in the day? And what they found is the average worker spends about 6 minutes in between inbox or Slack checks. So it's not just that 30% of your time is checking communications, it's that 30% is spread out evenly over the entire day. You rarely go more than 5 or 6 minutes without jump over, jump over, jump over, which is a cognitive disaster. I mean, that has the same impact on your ability to think as if every half hour you took a shot of whiskey. It's the
Right.
same sort of impairment,
That's
but it's a lot less
incredible.
fun.
That's
Yeah.
incredible.
So onwards to tips. Well, it's complicated. So for me, the biggest first step, and this was the core first step of the book Deep Work, is let's actually put a name to what we're trying to do. Let's actually note that deep work is a different activity than shallow work. And once you can just name it, now you start to realize that it's not just busyness as a proxy for productivity. It's not just I'm working or I'm not working. It's not just I'm exhausted or I'm bored, right? Just these general implicit indicators of busyness. You can say, how much of my time is doing deep work and how much is doing shallow work? Not that shallow work is unimportant. I mean, it's what keeps the lights on, keeps the customers from leaving. But deep work is what moves the needle. It's how you learn hard things, how you produce new value. I mean, it is the fundamental activity in knowledge work that's going to best produce value. And so even before I get into specifics about how to prioritize it, I think that, let's say, meta step of recognizing there's different types of work, and this type of work is really, really important. And then you being able to reflect on your own day and say, I do almost none of that. That's probably the most important step of anything else. It's just that awareness.
So once you have that awareness, and let's say you identify a gap that you're not spending enough time in deep work, how do you create more space for it?
Well, there's a couple easy things the individual can do. One thing that I've noticed works well and is popular, I've heard from my readers after the book came out, is to start scheduling deep work on your calendar just like you would any other meeting or appointment, and then respecting that time just like you would any other meeting or appointment. And so the advantage there is that we have social conventions based around meetings and appointments, right? So if you have a staff meeting from 10 to 11:30 tomorrow, and someone says, hey, can you jump on a call at 10? We completely understand. If you say, no, I have a thing until 10:30, like, great, people have appointments, meetings, we have to move around them. And so those same conventions can help protect deep work time. Because again, now let's say that's instead of a staff meeting, it's a deep work session. Same convention applies. No, I have a thing till 10:30. We'll have to do it after that. And so just as easy hacks go, this is a great one because A, it protects the time. B, it clearly delineates the time, right? Oh, I'm getting up to what I have scheduled on my calendar as deep work time. So you can switch in that mindset, know the rules, no context switching, no email, no phones. This is deep work time. And C, it gives you a record. Now you can go back and look at your calendar and immediately see how much deep work am I doing. It makes that ratio visual when you look at your calendar. So of all the different hacks and tricks I talk about in that book, that one is probably one of the more widely adopted, at least from the perspective of what an individual can do in their own work life.
Okay, that's awesome. And how, as leaders, can we do a better job of allowing our team members to engage in deep work and encourage that and support it?
Well, there's a couple things. One, it needs to be managed. I mean, deep work should be in the conversation of leadership and management. How much deep work do you do? How much deep work should you be doing? Are you hitting that number? How can we improve it? So one of the more important management tools that has come out of my work on deep work is the so-called deep to shallow work ratio. And the idea is quite simple. It says, if you're a leader, you should know for each of the people you supervise, you should work with them to establish what is the ratio of deep work, the shallow work hours in a typical week that is going to maximize that person's value to the team. And that's different for different positions. I mean, if you're almost entirely a support position, what's going to maximize your value might be a very low ratio. But on the other hand, if you're a computer programmer, the ratio is probably going to be extremely in the other direction. But to have a number, here's the ratio, is the foundation of a lot of cultural changes. Because here's what's happened. Here's the feedback I get from readers who have tried this. They say, once you have a number, you can measure it. And you can say, I'm not getting anywhere near what we thought would maximize my value. That is the leverage that often a leader or manager needs to actually make strong cultural changes. And I heard reports again and again from readers who would say, I was sure that our culture was completely immutable. This is deep in the DNA of this company, whatever it is, being on Slack or your Slacker or responsiveness, that this is deep in the DNA of our company. That'll never change. They try something like this, where here's a number, we're falling short of the number, suddenly massive changes are happening. That a lot of these cultures of constant connectivity and shallowness are a lot less entrenched than we think. The point is that you actually just have to have a stable surface to push off of to make some changes. The other reason why this is effective is that it's positive. So when you're just generically trying to swat down things you don't like, it's hard to get lasting changes. If you go to your boss and say, "Stop bothering me so much," you send me too many emails. These meetings are a waste of my time. Coming from a point of negativity, here's what I don't like. I want to get rid of it. It's hard to get lasting change. It seems a little bit personal. It seems a little bit, well, who cares? Work is not about your convenience. It's about value. But when you swap it and say, oh, we're trying to maximize the value we produce, suddenly more radical changes are on the table.
So, Cal, I want to shift to Digital Minimalism, your latest book, which is also a terrific read and certainly, I know, has been, as I said earlier, helpful for me. What's the big idea in this book? Can you just articulate that for our listeners?
Sure. So if deep work was about, in some sense, the unintentional consequences of tech in the professional world, digital minimalism is more about some unintentional consequences of technology in our personal lives or our lives outside of work. And the motivating premise is that starting a few years ago, at least as far as I could tell, our culture began to become really uneasy about their relationships, in particular with their phones. And this was something we used to be excited about. Increasingly, people are uneasy. And in particular, if you really look into this, the issue seems to be people think they're spending too much time on them. It's not that what they're doing when they look on their phone is terrible. It's that they're looking at their phone when they should be doing something better, that they're looking at their phone when they're with their kids or with their spouse, or they're looking at their phone when they could be doing something that would make their life more rich and rewarding. It's that lack of autonomy. So digital minimalism is a philosophy of technology use meant to push back on that state of affairs. It's an approach to your technology in which you're very careful and intentional about what you let into your life, where you try to maximize the benefits you get out of the tech you use and are pretty skeptical about bringing in technology that doesn't give you big wins. And it's something that, I've observed to be a really successful approach to getting tech on your side as opposed to working against you.
And I have to say this because this is amazing, right? You've never had a social media account. So tell me about, was that intentional sort of initially in your decision around that?
It's hard for me to remember exactly why I didn't sign up for social media in the first place. But over the years, it became quite a useful asset because it allowed me to have an anthropological detachment and observe this whole phenomenon with a little bit of distance, to actually see with some detachment what was happening. And the biggest thing I noticed, this is the really interesting thing about watching this from afar, is that we take for granted right now that we look at our phones all the time. That we're always on the phone, anytime you're in line, while you're walking, while you're driving, which is incredibly dangerous. So yeah, we all look at our phones all the time. And the story that we roughly tell ourselves is that that's what you do with phones. When phones and social media were invented, that's what we do. We look at them all the time. It wasn't the case, though. And because I watched this happen, there was actually a significant period where smartphones were widely used in the consumer market. Social media was widely used in the consumer market, but people didn't look at their phones all the time. That actually switched much more recently than people remember. And this is something I could notice with some clarity because I was outside that whole world. So the switch was a little bit more clear to me than I think it was for other people. But that was one of the big findings I talk about in the book, is that why did we start looking at our phones much more than we used to? A switch that happened right around this 2013, 2014 period. It's largely because the major attention economy companies, led by the major social media companies, re-engineered the experience of their app to play off the psychological vulnerabilities to get us to suddenly, and in a way that we didn't before, look at our phone all day long. And so we tell ourselves, like, well, this just must be how you use your phone. I wouldn't look at it if it wasn't so useful. To me, that's the huge reversal. That's not actually the case. It's not how we naturally use the phones. We were pushed into that when we weren't paying attention by a small number of companies that had to boost their revenue numbers because their IPOs were working.
God, like and you're talking about companies like Facebook, right? Who I know you talk about intentionally have fueled this addiction to our devices to drive their revenue.
Yeah, well, Facebook, the thing to remember about Facebook is they really were the leaders here. They were the first major social media company to go public. The thing to know about Facebook is that when Facebook first came around, and for the first almost 10 years of its existence, the way you used Facebook is that you would occasionally log on to see what your friends were up to, maybe a couple times a week. That was a disaster as far as their leadership was concerned when they're getting ready for their IPO, because they weren't getting nearly enough revenue from their large user base. And so their brilliant insight is that we have to transform the social media experience. It cannot be about, I want to see what my friends are up to. It has to instead be about, every time I hit this icon on my phone, I'm going to get information about other people, what they're thinking about me. I'm going to see social approval indicators. This is where you get the like button. And this is where retweets come in, which came in later. This is where you get favorites. This is where you get tags and photos. All of this created a rich stream of incoming social approval indicators. That is something that we cannot resist. If you tell me that every time I click on this app, I'm going to get information about what other people are thinking about me. And sometimes I'm going to discover they're thinking about me a lot. And sometimes I'm going to discover they're not thinking about me. And sometimes I'm going to discover they're mad at me. And that's waiting for me to discover. I just have to tap on this icon to see what my current status is. That shift completely transformed our relationship with our phones. It went from a tool that we occasionally use to something that we checked all the time. And once we'd been retrained to check all the time because of that transformation of social media, it just became habit. And now we do it for all sorts of tools and services. That was essentially 100% intentional. I mean, the like button was introduced originally for much more mundane reasons, but they realized right away its power to get people to look at the phone a lot more. And it revolutionized how that entire sector of the economy worked. And that's why Facebook today is worth almost twice as much as ExxonMobil. That's how much value they're getting out of people's time and attention. And that is entirely planned, right? That's a business plan that was executed. If we can get you to look at your phone, look at Facebook products for up to 2 hours a day, like the average American does, that's really good for them and their shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
It was disastrous.
Right.
It was disastrous for the users. What the users really needed was, this is nice that a couple times a week I can log on and see what some of my friends are up to. It's kind of a nice diversion. No one needed or asked for. What I really need is something I can compulsively swipe a couple hours a day every day. But that's what we got.
Well, and you think about that stat you just rolled out about Exxon. I mean, ExxonMobil, has equipment that they extract oil out of the ground with, right? Facebook, they just have people's fingers tapping right? And they're 2x ExxonMobil. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah, well, and the other part of the analogy, which I think is telling, is part of what helped the oil and gas industry in the last 30 years is they had the technological advance of fracking, right? They found out if we use this new high-tech process, we can extract natural gas from shales where we couldn't before. And that gives us access to a lot more of this than we thought there was out there. And it made them a lot of money, but of course, there's a lot of harm caused by the process. What Facebook did is essentially technological fracking. They had a technological breakthrough. If we rechange our product to be about incoming social approval indicators, it turns out we can vastly increase the store of time and attention that we can extract. We have access to much more time and attention than anyone has ever had in the history of the attention economy. And so I think of what they did as not a societal good, a sort of interesting innovation. It really is just attention fracking. A high-tech way of significantly increasing the amount of resource they're able to extract that has a lot of negative side effects and impacts for everyone involved.
So how do we move from sort of this fear of missing out, this mindset, to discovering the joy in missing out?
Well, the key of the digital minimalist philosophy is, just like it was with deep work and the deep to shallow work ratio, it doesn't work if you start from the perspective of the negative. So this is what I've learned. I've worked with a lot of people who've been working on these issues in their own life. And if you come at it from the negative angle, I don't like how much I'm checking this app. So I want to try to check it less. So let me take a day off every week, or let me do a detox, a term I really do not like being applied to the digital space. Let me change my notification settings to try to stop me from doing this thing I don't like. That doesn't last very long, right? The pressures are too strong to get you back there. What does seem to work is what digital minimalism preaches, which is start with what is positive. So you start by identifying, what do I really care about? What do I really want to spend my time outside of work doing, right? What makes my life better? And then for these things you've identified, then work backwards and say, okay, where can I strategically deploy technologies to amplify these things? Then the answers to those questions, that's the tech that's in your personal life. You ignore everything else. And so it's starting from scratch. It's like you clean out the whole proverbial closet, you Marie Kondo your phone, like let's take everything out and only add back in the things that give me really huge wins and be okay ignoring the rest. And so what you end up with is much less tech probably in your life, but maybe not, depending on how you answer those questions. And the tech that you're using is really helping things you care about. So it's making you much happier. And it's much easier now to resist everything else because you're starting from the premise of what's going to best amplify these things I love. And so it's much easier to say, well, I'm not going to sign up for TikTok because that doesn't strongly amplify a thing I really care about. That's a really easy decision to make. Or on the other hand, if you just say, I don't know, I'm trying to use tech less and I maybe look at my phone too much, and you look at something like TikTok, you're like, well, whatever. It's just yet another thing that might be interesting, and you're more likely to get sucked into that. So starting from a foundations of what you truly care about and using that to decide what you use and what you don't use is much more sustainable than starting from the negative. It's just like when you look at people who struggle to quit smoking. What group has a really much easier time doing that? Well, new mothers do. You have a very strong positive thing. I am not smoking because I'm trying to do something positive for my kids. I feel really strongly about this being positive. It's much easier to have a sustainable change than if you just say, I don't like how much I'm smoking, maybe I should do it less. And so that's essentially minimalism. Start with what you care about, deploy tech to amplify those things, and then be okay missing out on everything else.
And you talk about a 3-step process to sort of digitally declutter. Can you walk our listeners through that process?
Yeah, so what I recommend is that, okay, you first start by clearing out the proverbial closet. So you temporarily take off your phone, all of those apps that are pulling at your time and attention, get rid of all the saved passwords for the websites that you access. Your goal is to step away temporarily from all of these optional technologies in your personal life. So things like social media, things like looking at news online, things like video games, or even YouTube videos or streaming videos. Some of the people who went through this exercise for me had interesting rules they would place. They would say, I'm not going to watch Netflix except for when I'm with someone else. So there's various rules you could put in place. But basically, you're stepping away temporarily from all of these various tech in your personal life. Then I recommend putting aside a non-trivial amount of time. In the book, I say 30 days. That seems to work well, to not only get used to not having those things in your life, but to actively and aggressively, through experimentation and reflection, try to figure out, what is it I really care about? What is it that really makes my life more satisfying? What is it I really want to spend my time outside of work doing? That takes time. And that's why I say 30 days as opposed to just doing this over a weekend, is that most people actually need some time to get clarity on that. They need some space. Then when the 30 days are over, you rebuild your personal digital life from scratch. So you say, what do I want to add back in? And the only things I'm going to add back in are things for which I have a convincing story that this really amplifies one of these things identified I care about. And so I call that the digital declutter. A lot of people have gone through it now. It's a little bit drastic, but I think sometimes drastic action is what's needed to jumpstart drastic change. And so it's typically what I recommend to people, that if they feel overwhelmed by the technology in their life, I don't think nibbling around the edges typically gets the job done. You need to start from scratch. I think this is a good way to do it.
And so what advice do you have for people that say, gosh, this is a really important part of the way that I do my work? How do you advise people to navigate that?
Well, I tell them to put clear fences around the work stuff. Don't let them mix up. Right? Digital minimalism is about tech in your personal life, and don't let that mix up with tech in your work life. So where in your work life you have to intersect with some of these technologies, you put fences around it to make sure that you're accessing that technology in a way that really optimizes your professional benefits, but does not allow it to just bleed over and become a drain on your time in your personal life. And so in the book, for example, I spend some time working with really high-end professional social media brand managers, people whose job it is to use social media for very large corporations on behalf of the very large corporations. And one of the first things you'll notice if you spend time with them is that, first of all, their phone has nothing to do with it. They don't look at social media on their phone. They have these multiple monitors at their desktop. They have sophisticated tools for how they do social media searches to see what's going on and what's brand awareness. Their posting is on a very strict schedule. These things happen at their desktop and under strict times. It looks nothing like people sitting there scrolling while waiting in line. So I think where people get in trouble is that without the fences, you say, I'm required to post on Facebook occasionally for my business. Therefore, I use Facebook 2 hours a day. That's the leap where you get in trouble. So once people put fences, okay, here's how I use this stuff for work. Work is different than personal life. Have fences so they don't bleed over. It's much more controllable than people realize. And the open water here to get improvements is what's happening in your time outside of work.
I want to talk about that because I have read that you have a pretty strict sort of no work after 5:30 rule for you, which is terrific. I mean, what else do you do that you found particularly powerful in your own life as it relates to to deep work, digital minimalism, et cetera, that we can capture from the way you live every day?
Well, there's a few things. I mean, the fact that I don't use social media, never have, is immensely useful. So I don't have that distraction pulling at me. You can essentially simulate this in your own work life if you take it off your phone and maybe even use internet blocking software to ensure that you can only access it at the schedule that you think is useful for your work. So that helps. I'm also a big proponent of time blocking over to-do list. I mean, this is an idea that, again, goes all the way back to that original book by Peter Drucker, The Effective Executive. I look at my time and say, okay, here's my work day. Every minute needs a job. What am I doing during this hour? Okay, and then for this 30 minutes, I'll do this. For this next 2 hours, I'll do this. So I try to actually give every minute a job as opposed to saying I have a to-do list that I want to make progress on. That gives you a different relationship to your work. One of the things that happens is you're much less likely to do idle web surfing or to fall down distracting rabbit holes. If you have a to-do list, you say, well, okay, I've got these 2 things done. Now I'm going to look at these websites. Now I'll come back to this next thing. But if you're time blocking, you say, wait, no, this hour is supposed to be me working on this. And if I'm instead going down an internet rabbit hole, I am explicitly violating the schedule, and it's much more unavoidable. You're much less likely to do it. And so I'm a big proponent of blocking out hours in your day, giving a job to your minutes, as opposed to just running on to-do lists. So when I work during my work hours, I'm working intensely because every minute has a job. I don't web surf, don't take breaks. And then when I'm done, I'm done. And I think that works better for a lot of people. Work intensely when you work, then be done when you're done. Give every minute a job. You get a lot more out of your time, and it allows for much cleaner breaks. Now, if you have a job that requires you have to check in again at some point in the evening or something like this, that can be just as scheduled. I work until I work, then I'm done. Then I have this very well-defined 30 minutes when I do my check-in. Giving your time a job really helps you not only get more out of your cognitive resources, but it's a huge anxiety reducer because it puts a much clearer separation between those two worlds.
And how strict are you with that, right? So let's say you start and lean in a project that you've blocked out an hour, but gosh, you get into it and it's really going to take another hour, right? So you need 2. Do you pause inside of that and then just, inside of your calendar, pull that down and block out a little bit longer time? How do you handle that?
Well, the typical rule of time blocking is if you blow past something, you can wait till you're done with whatever it is. And then before you move on to the next thing, then you adjust the blocks. So you don't adjust the blocks when you get to the busted boundary. You bust the block, you change the blocks when you get to the end of the busted block. And the key thing to know about time blocking is that it's not a competition where you get the gold star if you stick to your original schedule. There's no actual value or benefit you get for sticking to your original schedule. Most time blockers will change their schedule 3 or 4 times a day on average. The key with time blocking is you want at every point going forward that you have an intentional plan for the time that remains. And the fact that time changes is really not so interesting. And depending on the job, in some jobs you have a lot of control. I think if you're a novelist, for example, and that's all you do, you could probably build time block schedules that are simple and aren't going to change. But if you're in a job where a boss might walk in frequently or client emergencies are a common occurrence, your blocks are going to change. The key is not to stick with the blocks. No one gives you a medal for that. The key is I kept building new blocks for the time that remained. I wanted the time that remained to have a plan for it. The thing you're trying to avoid is unintentional time that is being spent in an unintentional manner.
So I know you have 3 children and we have 3 teenage daughters as well. So I'm curious as a parent, how do you recommend that you approach this digital decluttering with our kids? And how do you approach in general technology and this digital world we live in as a father?
Well, there's 2 things I think are important and maybe will come across as a little drastic. One, I think at home, your phone should not be with you. This is about 3 or 4 years old, this notion that your phone is a constant companion that you need with you at all times. To a time traveler from 6 years ago, it would seem ridiculous that in your own house, you're walking around with your phone in your pocket. And so I'm a big proponent of put the phone in the foyer by the door. You can plug it in. That's where you charge it. That's where it is. If you need to look something up, go to the foyer by the front door and you can look something up. If there's some sort of urgent call or something you're expecting, put on the ringer. That conveys to your kids, I think, an incredibly important message, which is at least in this household, this portal into this world of engineered digital distraction is not something that we carry around with us. It's a tool that sits in the toolbox over there. We use it when we need it, but it's not something that we just have. I mean, your kids don't just see you looking at that thing all the time. And we tell ourselves we need to, but almost certainly we don't. The other place where I'm perhaps a bit more drastic, and this is easy for me to say because my kids are young, so I don't actually have to put this into practice yet, is I don't think, especially a young teenager, should have a fully featured smartphone or access to social media. My read of the literature on this, the evolving psychology literature on this, is that it can be quite damaging. I also don't think unrestricted access to video games, especially video games on the phone, I think that is also potentially quite dangerous, especially for young adolescents. I think the culture is going to shift on that. I think by the time my 6-year-old is 16, the idea that he would have had, Fortnite and or social media on a phone for the last 3 or 4 years will look back as a preposterous thing. I think the current young generation had the bad fortune of happening to be the first generation to grow up when this technology first became ubiquitous. And this is almost always the case with the new technologies. There's about a 10 to 15 year period where we just do exuberant experimentation. And then usually we settle down after that and figure out, okay, what's good and what's not. We're just leaving that period with social media and smartphones now, that period of initial exuberance and experimentation. And as we're looking back, we say, okay, so maybe 12-year-olds shouldn't have this. And I think that's going to become, right now it's very hard. If you're a parent of a 14-year-old or a 12-year-old, I think 10 years from now, it's not going to be socially hard to say, no, yeah, you're not going to have an iPhone.
And what about social media with kids? What's your take on that? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think it should be anywhere near them.
At all.
It should not be near them. We have these applications, these services have been finely tuned to play on psychological vulnerabilities to get use case up. That's bad enough for, a 30-something
right,
who might be looking at it more than they want. But you take a developing adolescent social brain, it's incredibly dangerous. And, the most disturbing data that you see coming out of this literature is that you look at these charts, and this is especially true if you hone in on young adolescent women, and you look at these charts of when they were born and incidents of anxiety or anxiety-related disorders, or equivalently hospitalizations for self-harm or suicide attempts. And you see, as soon as you get to the age cohort that had ubiquitous access to smartphones and social media, the graph just jumps. It just jumps. Jonathan Haidt at NYU has a pretty powerful talk. He'll go around about this where you can look at the chart and just see it jump. And as we learn more about that correlational finding, I believe the literature is becoming increasingly clear that, yes, this is what's causing it. More importantly, unlike a lot of public health epidemiological findings, this is what they're self-reporting, right? So often when you see
that's powerful.
When you see these correlational jumps, people who are smoking more get lung cancer more often. It's not that people directly feel, the cigarette feels like it's growing lung cancer, but this is actually a case when it comes to social media and mental health. Young, teenagers, especially teenage women, are increasingly self-reporting. Of course, this is the problem. Yes, this thing is making me feel terrible. It is exactly this. And that's kind of the strong, you have a correlational finding, and then you have the subject saying, of course, I'm telling you, it's as if the teenage generation is out there yelling, this is making me miserable. And yet we still have the psychologist, sitting there abstracted away from all that, being like, well, we're not quite sure. We have to look for causality, and we have to be careful about our statistical models. Meanwhile, 13-year-olds across the country, the ones I talk to, come to my book events, whose parents come and talk to me, are saying, I'm sick of this. It's making me miserable. And I think it's a public health issue that is, as this literature refines, is going to be increasingly hard to avoid.
Sure. That's interesting to hear you say it like that, right? That it's a public health issue. From the data in your research, it's changing the brain physically, right? It's literally changing our children's brains. Is that accurate?
Something like that seems to be going on. Especially for young people, their brains are developing. This must have an impact. We've seen this in adults, that as adults get more exposed to multitasking style behavior, attention switching style behavior, they have a harder time sustaining attention when the time comes for it. And so we're potentially breeding a whole generation that's going to have an incredibly hard time concentrating, which is terrible timing because our economy, as it gets more specialized and complex, is increasingly requiring hard concentration. And so we are developing a generation that's going to be uniquely ill-equipped for exactly what we need for success in our economy. And why are we doing it? Are we doing it for some other societal good? No, we're doing it largely so that 3 or 4 companies can have a higher stock price. And I think that's the tragedy of it all.
So let me ask you this, Cal. If our listeners could take one thing away from our conversation, right? I mean, you have just an incredible breadth of knowledge. What would that be?
We need to have more respect for our time and attention. And in the workplace, that means we should recognize that our ability to do undistracted focus is an incredibly valuable asset, something to be nourished and developed and deployed as much as we reasonably can. And when it comes to our personal life, don't just sit back and let the Exxon Mobils of the cognitive space have their way with this resource in your time outside of work. Say, enough. I'm going to take back control of the tech I use. I'm not going to put up with these pushback critiques that say, "Oh, you hate technology if you don't want to look at Facebook for 2 years," or something like this. I'm going to take control, wipe all this stuff out, clear all this stuff off your phone, get all that stuff off your computer, start from scratch, and say, "Let me try this again. Now that I know what I'm up against, what do I really care about? What do I actually need to use? Take control, ignore the rest of the noise, make the tech your ally instead of your enemy." Time and attention being respected. I think that's what we need to do, is grow that self-respect for our time and attention.
Mm-hmm. I like how you say that. So we end, Cal, with rapid fire. So I'm going to fire off some quick questions to you, and you just fire back what comes up.
Okay.
All right. So an app that you use to sort of survive in your digital minimalism world.
There's this little known app called Workflowy. So I think it's like workflow.ly. And all it is lists that you can indent. You can make bulleted lists. You can indent under the indented list, and you can collapse them up and down. And you can put tags. So you can put a hashtag. And wherever you've placed hashtags, you can just click on it, and it'll just show you the things that are illustrated with that hashtag. So it's the simplest possible interface for collecting list of information. And it's how I manage, with a minimum of engagement with technology, all of the different tasks and projects that are going on in my life. It takes the friction involved in recording things and tracking things and organizing things and reduces it down as small as possible, so I can get in, get out. What do I need to work on? Throw things in there and get back to working as quickly as possible.
What is your morning routine?
That's an interesting question. So it depends. It depends when I end up waking up, but I'm usually up early. My 16-month-old ensures that. And typically what I'll do is, I might do some writing in the morning early before the rest of the kids get up. And then I walk my oldest kid to school. And then after that, it is on my way to the office. So I usually get right into a shift of work, and then it's some time with my kids, and then back into work.
What's one habit that changed your life?
Time blocking with shutdowns, which I put in place when I was actually a graduate student working on my dissertation, not only made me much more effective, but completely changed the anxiety that work produced in my life. So this idea that I have a plan for the day, I execute the plan. When I'm done, I do a shutdown. So I say, do I have a good plan for tomorrow? Is there anything hanging I need to worry about? Am I okay? Great, shutdown. And I could trust that shutdown, allowing me then to have my evenings free of having various unfounded, ungrounded work thoughts bouncing around. Was a game changer in terms of my relationship to work. I have this nerdy phrase I talk about in one of my books, is that after I would do the shutdown routine, I would actually say, shutdown complete. And, I'm a little embarrassed by it, but just to have the phrase, because then the point of the phrase is later in the night when your mind is like, no, we need to ruminate on this from work. You can say, nope, I said shutdown complete earlier. I wouldn't have said it if I hadn't executed my review. So everything must be fine. And so now I'm happy to report that it's a bit of a meme in the productivity nerd world. And there's now thousands of people around the country who whisper shutdown complete to themselves each evening.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. That's cool. So what's one of the most favorite books you've ever read?
A book I read that was a real eye-opener, sort of an esoteric book, but I think is really cool for these discussions of tech and how they affect us, was called, I think it was called something like Medieval Society and Technological Change by Lynn White Jr. It's a book that was published in the 60s. And the whole book is a case study about how the introduction of the horse stirrup, into medieval Europe, and Germany in particular, around the year 900, how it inadvertently led to the rise of feudalism. entirely new form of government. And I think it's such a crucial case study because it shows how technologies can have these really unplanned, massive impacts. And then we look back and try to back justify and tell lots of stories. There's tons of stories about like, well, this is why feudalism is the right government. You can look at the kings of the times and the vassals, like, yes, feudalism is God's, whatever. Like tons of justifications. But you look all the way back and it was actually an accidental side effect of this new way that you could ride horses entering into Europe. And to me, that's really important to remember because I think there's a lot of digital horse stirrups in our world right now.
Interesting.
There's a lot of technologies that have these huge impacts that change the way we live in ways that no one planned, no one intended, or no one thought was a particularly good or bad idea. And then we try to backfill like, well, this must just be good or there's a reason for it or whatever. And it's humbling to recognize like sometimes this tech just blows things up. And so we shouldn't be too wed to whatever the latest big trend or change is. We should be willing to step back and say, this might not be ordained. It might actually be an accident. Is this really what we want to do?
Interesting. So what is, Cal, what's your favorite hobby?
I read a lot. I don't know if that counts as a hobby, though, because it's also professional. But that's probably the thing I spend the vast majority of whatever leisure time I have outside of family time. Time I actually have to myself is almost entirely reading. So there must be something to that brings me back. I read an incredible number of books at the same time. But with my kids, like there's a couple things we're into. So me and my boys right now are really we're building circuits. So we're building little gadgets. We're learning how to solder wires together and do the electrical engineering calculations, get lights hooked up the switches and these type of things. And so that's been fun recently.
Jeez, I bet. That's cool. Those boys don't know how blessed they are to have you as their dad and doing projects like that.
Well, I'm a nerd, so I have fun with it.
So the show's called Game Changers with Molly Fletcher. So one of the last questions I have is, who's a game changer who inspires you and why?
Well, someone who really inspired the writing I've been doing on tech and society, if we focus in on that, is I was inspired by a computer scientist named Jaron Lanier, who is now at Microsoft, but he's famous because he was really one of the original pioneers of virtual reality back in the 80s when that technology was first coming up. He arguably was the person who coined that term. And starting in the mid-2000s, he started writing these brilliant, in parts downright crazy, but just brilliant manifestos that completely defamiliarized the world of technology around us and was really early to pointing out, here are some flaws that we're not thinking about, and we shouldn't be so quick to be so exuberant about it. And I think he's just such an original and smart thinker that seeing his work starting that early point of the 2000s convinced me, all right, there's more people that need to be thinking this way. And so I think he was one of the early game changers, one of the early critics, because he was from the world of technology. And I'm a huge booster of these things. But there's real problems, and I don't think we're admitting it yet. And so his manifesto from 2006, "You Are Not a Gadget," really changed the way that my intellectual life unfolded.
Well, and you're the similar version in 2019, I would argue, right? You have certainly taken someone who inspired you and unlocked it inside of yourself, adding value to so many people in the world.
Yeah, so I have to give him and some related authors credit for helping me shift my attention in that direction.
Well, Cal, thank you so much. Your book, Deep Work and Digital Minimalism is, just a terrific read. I can't encourage people enough. How do people find out more about you? How do people learn more about you or connect with you if they want to?
Well, I'm hard to connect with, but that's somewhat by design. But you can learn about my books at calnewport.com. I'm also a big fan of blogging. I've been doing it since 2007. So at calnewport.com, there's over a decade of weekly essays on all these type of topics. So if you want to wet your toes in the somewhat extreme world of Cal Newport technological thinking, calnewport.com is a great pond to do that in.
Absolutely. Well, and I will attest to you are hard to get to, but we stayed with it, man, because this was a great conversation. So thanks so much for coming on.
Well, thanks, Molly. It was my pleasure.
Thanks, as always, for listening to Game Changers with Molly Fletcher. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. There you can listen to previous episodes and leave us a review, which helps other people find out about the show. For more about me, visit mollyfletcher.com. Until next time, stay curious and be bold.